sit down and you're here for the Creative Minds talk, please take a seat. My name is Nidhi Gandhi. Thank you so much for coming to our Creative Minds program with Sofia Karim. This is a program in conjunction with our exhibition downstairs, Seeing Through Stone, which is part of Visualizing Abolition, and there are two other venues presenting Seeing Through Stone: the Institute of the Arts and Sciences at UC Santa Cruz, as well as Santa Cruz Barrios Unidos. So please take a trip over the hill and check those out. This talk will be featuring Sofia Karim, but she will be joined with our two illustrious co-curators of the Seeing Through Stone exhibition, Gina Dent, Dean of Humanities for DEI and Associate Professor at UC Santa Cruz, and Rachel Nelson, Director and Chief Curator of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences. If everyone could hold their questions till the end of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. And one last thing, the San Jose Museum of Art is on the unceded ancestral land of descendants of the Ohlone Nation. The Ohlone Nation is represented by numerous tribes, indigenous organizations, and individuals with whom we strive to build relations. SJMA acknowledges and celebrates the continued presence of our region's indigenous communities, expresses gratitude for their stewardship, and pledges an ongoing commitment to learning and sharing our histories. Thanks very much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it off to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually start by having Sofia introduce her practice a little bit for all of us tonight. So if you don't mind, Sofia, the amazing artist and architect, you show us some images.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to show some images. I won't talk too much. Just let the images sink in. I'll explain a few things. So my journey really begins. I was a regular architect. I still am an architect. I did a normal architecture job until 2018, when something quite big happened in my life. My uncle is a Bangladeshi photographer and social activist, Shahidul Alam, and we got a phone call on the night of the 5th of October from my parents in Dhaka saying the police have taken him. He's gone. We don't know where he is. He'd been reporting on student protests, and 30 plainclothes police officers turned up at his flat and abducted him. And the next time I saw him was on TV, which is this image here, and he's being taken to court, and he shouts out to the press cameras, they beat me, they washed my blood-stained Punjabi and made me wear it again, they denied me legal representation, at which point a hand is clamped over his mouth and they take him away. And a huge campaign began. I started working on that campaign full-time from London. The campaign was grassroots activists and students in Bangladesh, and then it went all the way to Nobel laureates and things. And after 107 days, he was released. While he was in jail, I began constructing the prison in my mind through fragments and stories that my aunt said about the spaces that he was in. And then after he was released, I had some conversations with him, and then I made these small architectural models based on his memories and my imagination. I also was drawing at the same time. Some of these drawings were mainly figurative drawings. After he was released, I pretty much was now converted to becoming an activist, and I continued campaigning for other political prisoners, but also focusing on kind of social justice movements and the protest movements that were happening in India and continue to happen against the fascist government of Narendra Modi. And one of the prisoners I was campaigning for is Professor G.N. Sai Baba, who is a professor of English at Delhi University, and he was incarcerated on life sentence in India. And I began writing letters to him and making drawings based on his poems. And these drawings are quite different to the other drawings, and I just wanted to show you them because my whole kind of language of art is still architecture, and it's the only language I had. And it's the language I was using to process what I was seeing. So I started drawing this thing called Lita's house, and it's an imaginary house for the jailed, disappeared students, activists, political prisoners I was campaigning for, and it was where I imagined that they reside, and some of them were killed. That's Professor Sai Baba. I just quickly want to read you. So about these drawings, I wrote to Professor Sai in jail about these drawings, and I wrote, in the letter I wrote, "Today I reread your poem, When is the New Year?" and realized that I included several words and spatial concepts from that particular poem in my early architectural drawings for a body of work titled An Architecture of Disappearance. It's an ongoing body of work in which I explore architecture as a language of struggle and resistance. Prison clock, my exploding pain, massive time gathers, monstrous machine. All these words appear in the drawings, which depict architectural space as a system of the whole tiny universe with all its planets and stars of galaxies, which you said appeared behind your closed eyelids. The drawings are mainly black, and it is this sense of the void that I feel so strongly today. What this notion of the void represents, even in my own drawings, I cannot say. I'm unable to decipher meaning. And this is a series of diptychs, and this work is included downstairs. So, whilst campaigning, I have to carry on my day job as an architect, and I'm working on quite mundane or seemingly mundane projects. But the work creeps its way into this too. So these are construction drawings I was making on everyday projects I was working on. And the way I began to draw changed. I never stopped drawing them in CAD, I stopped drawing them in black and white, and I began to draw them in luminous colours, in pencil, knowing that I would send them to prison. So I'm wearing parakeet green, because when I wrote to Sai and said, "What's your favourite colour?" he said, "I see no colours here, but the colour I dream of is parakeet green." So I made, and a poem he wrote to his wife, he said, I don't want your computer letters, I want your handwritten letters with the curve of your hand, and I get the smell of you from the work. So I made pencil drawings and thought very carefully about the weight of the line, and so that it was as close to my touch as possible. So I made these paper drawings in luminous colour in pencils, and they were made to be sent to prison. But each one has a twin for the outside world, which is what you see. And that's this ghost image of the diptych. And it's drained of colour, it's only digital, no touch, no smell. And you'll notice that the drawings have strange names for architectural construction details, and the titles are lines from his poems, which he'll know. So this one is A Tad Bit of a Dry Breeze, brick upstand detail, scale 1 to 2 section. This one is In the Glow of My Blood. August monsoon morning, flitch beam to joist connection, section 1 to 50. Lonely at this hour in our garden of love, external wall door jam, plan 1 to 2. And then just the last thing I was going to talk about is kind of a story. So in 2021, there's an island in Scotland called Iona, and it's known as the Thin Place. And the Thin Place is said in kind of Celtic mythology to be places where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world is said to be thin. And these could be buildings or places. I'd say that forest you took me to, Rachel, for me that's a thin place, the Redwood Forest, Santa Cruz. So I was on Iona, and there was this small chapel, and I was cycling to the chapel every day. And there I was lighting 16 candles for the BK-16 prisoners in India who I was campaigning for. And I started making drawings of the chapel and sending them to Professor Anand Teltunde, who was one of the prisoners, and I wrote, sometimes I wonder if drawings are thin places. Perhaps that's why I send you drawings, as a means to escape into the image and enter another world, a world on the other side of this planet, or a world even beyond this, where Father Stan resides. I don't know. Father Stan was his co-accused, an 84-year-old Jesuit priest and tribal activist who died in prison. So I was sending these things to prison, and then Professor Anand wrote back and he said, Dear Sophia, received your lovely drawings of Iona Abbey, many thanks. Indeed, drawings are thin places. They metamorphose physical objects into spiritual things that communicate beyond words. So I was doing exhibitions and asking people to sign letters for their release. And in November 22, he was released, and that's him the day after his release at home, and he's holding the book of the 800 letters people signed in the exhibition. And whilst I was, even before I could send those diptychs, miraculously Professor Saeed was released. And so just 2 weeks ago, I sent the physical diptych to him at home, which makes me happy. And then Shoma Sen, she's a lawyer, she's one of the BK-16 prisoners, she was released. And that's the end.
Hi everyone. As you can probably tell, that wasn't so much an end as more beginnings. There's so much, Sophia, that you've already given us, so much richness in the work you've made, and then also the way you speak. And I think there are also things that might require some translation. I don't mean linguistic, but conceptual and regional translation. But maybe I'll ask you in an indirect way. In prison abolition work, there's a new emphasis, more recent emphasis on abolition geographies. This is brought through a scholar named Ruth Wilson Gilmore, primarily. Do you know this work? Interesting. So this is where, translation. So it would be hard to summarize exactly, but Gilmore by field is a cultural geographer, which is a more recent subfield of geography, which contests kind of mode of geography of kind of creating property and kind of affirming racial capitalism as it moves around the world, and instead is attending to human scale. And then through that, she does work which is very much focused on vulnerabilities, racial, sexual, other kinds of vulnerabilities, gender vulnerabilities, and of course, our major work for the last, 30 years has been in relation to prisons. And so she's one of the people that I've worked with and many of us have worked with who has been a leader in the abolition movement. I'm only explaining that to say that you've made me really grapple with abolition geographies differently. I think both in terms of the relationships that are implied between Bangladesh, India, and the UK, and the rest of the world in your work and in the politics you're describing, but also in your relationship to architecture that you're talking about. So you left a little nugget for the audience of how both your entry to this work, but also how this work moves into your ordinary architectural practice. And I just wonder if you could say more about that, because just as your work with political prisoners has actually led you into another world of thinking about carcerality more generally, I feel like you are saying something with architecture and working in intimate spaces with people in ways that work backward from the usual direction work. In other words, the extension of kind of notion of privacy, property, somewhat ownership that normally is what makes it possible to hire an architect and have a space created for you is more aligned with a dominant way of thinking about and ordering space. And yet you're talking about actually learning from all of this work and these relationships and your literal work with your hands and bringing that knowledge into the design of other space, which seems to me to be an incredibly important abolitionist practice, because a lot of what we talk about is not just thinking about ending prisons, but thinking about what that necessitates in terms of transformations in our more intimate relationships and in our lives in general. So I just wonder if you could give a little more detail about kind of how this shows up and what happens for others.
Okay, so when I was 10 years old, I was in my father's village, and it's an earthen house. And I remember sitting on the bed, and the sunlight comes through, and it comes through woven bamboo screens, and it hits the earth wall. And it's going through the wood smoke, because everyone cooks with wood there. And I'm mesmerized by the play of light on that wall. And I just watch it for ages. And at that point, I think I want to be an architect. And I don't really even know what architecture is, but I think that's what I want to be. I become an architect, and it's terribly disappointing. I mean, neoliberalist architecture is nothing to do with that. That kind of visceral, spiritual thing never happened. This thin place didn't happen again. But what I know is that for me, architecture has always really, in its essence, has always been connected to the human condition. And there's something about the inherent melancholy of certain architectural spaces, not necessarily designed by an architect, so this private property thing and, you know, the star architect designing, it's nothing to do with that. These certain spaces that you will go in, and there's this inherent melancholy. For me, that speaks of suffering and mercy. And I think actually power has always understood that relationship. So if you think of religious buildings, so say churches, they know that if you have a very awe-inspiring space, it makes someone connect with an existence beyond themselves. And in those buildings, they will say, you're supposed to connect with the suffering of Christ. Or in Islamic architecture, it was about, you know, geometry was about connecting with an underlying reality beyond ourselves. And so I always knew about this connection. And then when I get into activism, one half of my work is much more, of artwork, is much more explicit and quite didactic. And that's a kind of form of art, of the art of dissent that exists. But what I could see is that other art forms, in their forms of art of dissent, have other layers where some of the work is not so didactic. They have much more sophisticated languages of the art of dissent. So if you think about poetry or music, or if you think about jazz, it's a much more nuanced and, very sophisticated kind of expression of the art of dissent. And I thought architecture doesn't really have that. I can't think of an example of the art of dissent. And David Adjaye's Museum of African American History doesn't do it for me. That's not what I'm talking about. That's not what jazz is doing. And I'm not saying I'm doing that, but I think those are the realms I was trying to get to. And it was the stories and getting deeper and deeper with those prisoners I was campaigning for that opened the doors for me, because Sai Baba's poems, and he's an activist, but when you look at his poems, they're these strange, visceral things on the edges of life and death where meaning is not very clear, and for me they're more like the writing of Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, or jazz, where it's a different level.
Just because I want to understand though, if you have a client, an ordinary client, how do they feel when you bring elements of this into their spaces?
That's interesting. So architecture is a very cruel profession. I wrote this to Sai. I said, I'm making these designs and nobody wants them. But that's never been something to stop me. So I never found a client who's going to let me explore this stuff. So what could I do? So I'm designing this like shitty, little mundane kitchen extension in Oxford. And I put a red window in it. And to be honest, when I put the red window in, I don't actually start with the politics in my work. I start with my craft, and I'm thinking about the light and the detail and the kind of alchemical aspects of space and how it feels. A bit like music, it changes you. So I think about those things. But I notice myself, I'm putting a red window in. Why am I putting that red window? Is it because it's the lull gate, which is, lull means red, the red exit gate that the BK16 prisoners dream of? Is that what it is? And then I don't tell the client that it might be anything to do with that. And also, why do you have to? Art doesn't have to be so, you don't have to explain every move you make. And you don't know yourself as an artist where many moves come from. So I put these things in, and then they love the window and they think that's beautiful. And then, in other places there's a little door and a big door, and the door is a door the size of a child. But I think also I know that in the undercell, in some of those drawings you saw an egg. Under means egg. So the solitary confinement cell is the undercell. To enter it, they walk through a gate which is very low. But the guards don't belittle themselves by walking through that low gate. They walk through a taller gate with their head held high. So in some spaces I'll put a little door which is for a child, where someone of our height would have to humiliate themselves and walk low, and then there'd be another gate door which is a red door, and that's a taller door. So I put it in those ways. In a way, I think that's more subversive than a museum of African American history, which no one will give me, so I gave up that dream.
So I have to say that when we met with Sofia, and we are showing also the models, so those beautiful pieces that she's made with her uncle are on view at the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, and we were familiar with that work, but she began to describe this red window in the doors, and we were like, that always gave me, like I told Sofia, I just keep crying lately that I don't know what it is, or just getting choked up, but I was like, well, it's like an architecture of abolition. She's always adding the window or the door. I don't know what, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm not sad, I'm actually super relaxed. But so, but I was thinking about the ways in which this works, the ways in which you're always, the architecture of disappearance. In some ways, because when you begin the architecture of disappearance, one of the things you're thinking about is all the disappeared, right? But you begin to instead figure out how to disappear the prison. I can't answer a question. I don't. And we've also been talking for days, and I'm like, I've stored up all this information that I know I'm not going to say. So sorry, everybody. I'm emotion forward. But so I thought that maybe you could talk a little bit about your process of coming to this kind of disappearance, because I do think that when you were working with your uncle, and one of the stories that you told me was about the way that it affected your sense of scale. And now this place where now you are creating really the first examples that I've seen that I would call an architecture of abolition. I'm sure that there will be more, and maybe there are more, but these are the first that I've looked at. And I said, oh, I see that when you draw the joins in the wall, you're also drawing that they can be unjoined.
Yeah, that's interesting. And this conversation is actually making me think of something that I haven't even processed myself. So I'm kind of working this out now while I'm talking to you. So when I was making those detailed drawings for the diptychs that you see downstairs, so we talked about scale. And first, one thing is when I'm doing technical detailing, it calms me down. And as an activist, I kind of need that, I think, that, or even, when you're dealing with things in your mind that are heavy, drawing these technical things calms me down. And especially going deeper and deeper into the detail. But then, when I started to draw things at one-to-one scale, I'm having to draw the actual layers in the wall and the elements in the wall. So there are things like a vapor barrier, which stops condensation going into the insulation and turning it moldy. And then I started thinking, in a cell, a vapor barrier would also pick up the condensation of a human breath, of someone that's in a compressed cell. And then the colors I began to use, started to use pastel and smoky colors or cloud-like colors, and trying to get this sense of the breathing of the wall and the breath within the wall. And then the kind of 10mm joints between the brick made me think of the other dimensions. And there's another detail where I keep a 10-inch gap, and I know that in the Amdani cell, which was shown there's bodies packed together. Each prisoner gets 10 inches of space. They have to pay a little more if they lie. So in the 10 inches, they lie groin to groin, scissor formation with their legs knotted together. If they pay more, they can lie side by side, but it's 10 inches of space. And I think in a conversation with you, Gina, I was saying I found this old photo of like the Brooks abolitionist poster slave ship. And in the tiny text, I was like, whoa, they've said that there's on the lower deck, each slave got 10 inches. And then these dimensions start coming into those drawings. Yeah, I'm just working these things out. Sorry, it's not very coherent what I'm saying. Yeah.
I actually found it quite coherent, and just because, you know, we have the pleasure and have the honor of talking with you over time, but I think this last detail is worth emphasizing, because a lot of the work we're doing, and I would say the part that most surprises people, is that we're not focused solely on the United States and its problem of mass incarceration, which is focused almost exclusively on Black and brown people. And of course, that's a huge problem, but the problem of carcerality is much bigger. And the ways that our histories are disconnected from each other is connected to power and forces that we need to work against, and we need artists to help us work against. And so I think you all probably are all familiar with those images of slave ships that you can see in many history books and online everywhere, and the Brooks is maybe the most famous that's shown. And so just allowing people to think with the relationship. So in the galleries and institute, where you have those models and people have gone and looked at them, even people who didn't have that conversation with you have immediately made that connection.
Wow. Okay.
And I think that's important for you to know, also important to think about the process of working with art toward abolition, because the didacticism that alienates people so much, right? Where we're told information and we're supposed to just internalize that information, and there's a war over information, is not appealing to anyone. So the only way we can really shift towards something different is both to understand each other in different ways, and this is what I meant by translation, but also to extend the possibility that what we need to learn is in the way we need to learn it. And so much of what you're doing through your craft is helping us to think with that. So I did want to just emphasize how important it is to me personally and how moving it is to be with those objects, because of the way that it immediately communicated something to me that I've heard over and over again as a scholar who studied Black studies, but also as someone whose own family constantly references that sense of space and scale.
Can I add something to that? You just made me think, because you talked about art. Something interesting was happening. So you know, I showed the drawings I did with figurative bodies. And so I was drawing them knotted together. Those poses were so intimate, I could only try them with my children to understand how do you do that. And then I was drawing them again and again and again, these figurative bodies. And then I write this essay. It's an essay on architecture, and I say that I'm drawing the bodies again and again, sometimes as bodies, and sometimes I abstract them and I make the bodies vectors in space. So in the Black drawing, sometimes you see these clusters of lines, and they are those bodies as vectors in space. And I'm just playing. I'm playing to see, messing about with what does this do in architectural space. But at a certain point, I realized that, and then you maybe saw those stacks and stacks of bodies in the drawings as clouds. And at a certain point, I realized when I'm making these drawings, I'm not just drawing these bodies now, I'm drawing bodies stacked on bodies and the final stages of human subjugation, not now only or in Bangladesh, but in the past and to come. And I write, what if it were my children in that pile? And when I'm seeing what's happening in Palestine and the rubble, that comes to me. And when I say that, I don't mean that I'm universalizing, say, slavery or Holocaust or what's happening in Bangladesh. I'm just saying that as the artist, when you're drawing your situation, something happens where you can't help but bring in the memory of other situations. And it goes beyond these kind of academic discourses of, can you compare this with that, and are you drawing parallels? It just happens from something inside, and you realize that you're not only talking about what you're drawing right now, you're talking about other things.
I mean, one of the things when you say that, I've told you, but I'm going to say it again, that one of the things that in that sense where you're talking about something so specific, and one of the things about, in talking particularly about the models, which I hope everybody really looks at the diptychs and sees the models too, that, you know, you've made these like spaces that are so huge in your uncle's memories and so huge into your memories, into these small spaces where you're looking at these details, right? The bodies kind of clenched together. And one of the things that I was telling Sofia is some of the people that have visited the gallery who have been incarcerated in the United States, the things that they say when they look at them is they begin to think of them not within a comparison. I actually thought that we would be talking about comparisons. So for instance, the model where your uncle is standing at the bars and his devised shelves so that the birds will come in and he saves his food to feed the birds. To me, when I saw them, I thought, oh, this is so different in the US. Nobody in the United States has a window, right? Nobody can see, is in a cell where you can see through a window and a bird could fly in. The windows are opaque. There are no open windows. There's no open bars, right? There's always another thing to deny sight. And actually, when somebody who was inside, who's very young, so I call him a kid. He's not he would not like me to call him a kid, but he was inside for 14 years. When he saw it, and I said, you know, they have open bars, so they were able to get in birds. And he's like, oh, but he wasn't interested in that. What he was interested in was the desire to have a pet. So then he started telling me all about his cell and the ways in which he got a pet lizard that came and lived in his cell with him. And then he built a little structure out of the cardboard boxes that the food supplies come in for his pet, and he devised a leash that the lizard hated, so he would just wear the leash wear the lizard on his shirt. And then his other friends on the tier actually made a little cell for the lizard that he was like, don't put my friend in jail. But I was like, you know, this whole conversation, this whole thing, and I tell you that his face, like he opened up in a way that the fact that it wasn't in the United States, that it wasn't all of this, but that he did see a universal. He said we all want something to take care of.
Yeah, I think my uncle said that as well, that the animals, and there's a model with the little cats, and that's Goldugda. Goldug, the name means mirth. That's not his real name, but his jail name was Mirth. And he has 70 cats. Then he brought them from the old jail to the new jail, and he feeds them milk. And they said it was that opportunity to nurture something, because in prison there weren't many opportunities to nurture. But also something else I think is important is when you're actually drawing those figures, another thing happens. So, because I was campaigning for political prisoners, some people thought, oh, that's quite noble because they're political prisoners. You know, morally that's okay. They're not murderers or rapists or. And when you draw, or I find when I draw, I don't care what someone's done, the morals of it. I don't care if they were a murderer or a rapist. Something happens when I'm drawing where I'm transcending that. And for me, that shifted my sense of morals and how I judge people. And I don't make a distinction between that's a political prisoner and therefore worth defending and releasing, and this person shouldn't be released because they're not a political prisoner.
I know we're going to get to questions, and our illustrious curator, Lauren Shell-Dickens, is here not speaking. So I just want to acknowledge, first of all, Lauren and her fabulousness, and the fact that she brought us together. But I also was really, it's so inspiring listening to you talk, and I was thinking, what difference would it make if part of an art education was that relationship to thinking about what it means to draw a figure? You know, and I'm struck also in what you're saying about figuration, because for us in the project, we've had a difficult relationship with figuration because of the habits and the kind of common tropes in representations of incarceration. You know, you have bars, shackles, you know, and then there's a lot of supposedly counter, a kind of counterweight through drawing human figures as this kind of source of, or idea of recovering something. And there are two things that, at least that you said just now, and one I want to emphasize. We talk a lot now about self-care and the need for, you know, kind of this kind of individualist wellness. But I think the profound lesson that nurturing another being is so essential to living is very important. And I also am really thinking about how your meditation on figuration and description of it would create a very different environment. I know you were trained as an architect and not as a visual artist in the same way, but I'm just reimagining what it would mean to approach drawing and creating figures in that way. And I just wonder if you want to say anything more about that, and sort of, you know, the difference for you between the models and your drawings, and even that transition you just drew out between knowing the bodies were intertwined this way and then using the lines.
Yeah. So when making 5 years ago, I wasn't even an artist, and my career's kind of progressed quite quickly in those 5 years. And one thing I was very conscious of was I don't want to be mining people's pain to advance my career as an artist. And I think I'm lucky that I work with activists who have nothing to do with the art world, and the families of the prisoners, because they'll keep you right. If they think you're using them to advance your art career, they'll let you know. And so, where was I going with this? So when I was the night my uncle was abducted, I began having to have really strange dreams about architectural space, and I was seeing spaces I'd never seen before, sort of expanding, contracting, expanding again. And I now knew that for whatever reason my relationship with architecture had changed, and I was obsessively trying to construct the prison in my mind, but also kind of hold on to these abstract qualities. And they were quite painful, the spaces. It was almost like architecture that was formed of emotion or color, and they were raw and painful. So when I began making art about it, I remember I made one thing, and I showed it to my aunt, Shahidul's partner, and she's brilliant, she's an activist, very sharp, and she said, it's too sentimental, it's too romanticized, you know, it's not, the pain isn't there, you can't understand the pain of not being able to touch him. And I remember once I tried to touch him, and he tried to touch me through the glass screen, and the warden gave such a sharp, and the hurt in his eyes, I just can never forget that, and it's about bringing in that pain. So then I'm thinking, okay, how do I bring in that pain? And then I speak to my uncle, and he says, it's interesting she said that. That's a valid you can do that in your art. But I'm just going to tell you that everyone's experience is different, and even within the prison, our experiences were different. And for me, the things I really remember are the birds, the kind of relationships that we had with the other prisoners, the garden we made. And then I realized I'm going to abandon this abstract stuff, although it's important to me, and I did do the abstract stuff in Lita's house, I needed to. But for those models, I was like, I'm going to abandon it, and I'm just going to talk with, let's do stories. Because when I was little, I used to live in his flat, and he used to tell me stories, and his house smelled of photochemicals, and I used to love it in bed. And so it was going a bit like going back with him telling me stories, and then I made these quite figurative models for that reason.
So I think if anybody has questions, we could take some questions now. I also think the one other thing that might be interesting for people to hear is this link that to hear more about, is this link you've made between art and activism. Because the way that you've used, and this is while y'all think of questions, so I'm not just talking over you, but the ways in which you use art spaces as activist spaces, regardless of their intent. So using them, for instance, for letter writing campaigns that have been successful. But that actually, and the work, actually, the exhibition, the campaign that you did at Take Turbine Hall, of course. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Because, I mean, it's such a great story.
Yeah, so that was when I was campaigning for my uncle. The Cuban performance artist Tanya Bruguera had her big commission in the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern. And a Peruvian curator who had just done a protest exhibition at Lima for my uncle, using my uncle's photos of extrajudicial killings in Bangladesh. He said, I've got these prints, I'm in London, take them and do an exhibition, where are you? I said, I'm in Tate Modern seeing Tanya Bruguera's thing. And then he said, why don't you reach out to her and ask her if she'll help you? And I was like, she's not going to help me. She's like a famous artist. Bye. And then the next day I get a WhatsApp and he says, come tomorrow to the Turbine Hall. I'm with Tanya Bruguera. Bring those prints of extrajudicial killings. We're going to do a protest exhibition for your uncle. She was brilliant. Her thing had just opened. So we laid the prints, and they're all written in Bangla, but it doesn't matter. People are using some weird Google thing to translate. And then it's holiday, so kids are doing cartwheels all over the prints, but he would love that. And then some newspapers do some articles. And then word gets back to my uncle. In the prison visiting, there's a model you'll see of the visiting room where you have to screen through the layers of grills to the prisoners. So my mum had devised this method where she'd write, because you can't hear, she'd write, and then she said, they did this thing at Tate Modern, and then she said he smiled. And for me, that's all that matters. And so some people might say, isn't it a sellout to work with people like Tate Modern? And I was like, I don't give a shit, he smiled. So yeah, and then so after he was released, I was like, I've got my foot in the door here, I'm going to use it again. So in India, there's mass protests because Modi has introduced citizenship laws to incarcerate Muslims. 200 million Muslims are at risk. They're even on the genocide watch list now. And Shaheen Bagh's having this incredible Muslim women-led protest, a sit-in. And so I say, let's do with the activists I'm working with, let's do a solidarity protest in the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern. And so we contact Tate Modern and we say, look, you don't need to get involved. You've got your politics, we've got ours. The Turbine Hall is a civic space. You let Extinction Rebellion use it, we're coming. And so that's what we were planning, and then it got shut down 2 days before, because of COVID, before the demonstration. But it didn't matter because we're now running on like social media, and then it keeps growing and it's still growing.
Amazing. Are there questions? Yes.
I'm curious, are there any organizations that you work with for political prisoners, like Amnesty
Yeah, I've worked with Amnesty for sure, Human Rights Watch, and then many of the Indian and Bangladesh groups, but I never go with any one organisation, as in I just stay free. And even our activist group, I never made it an NGO or a company, because I don't want to sit around doing tax returns and I don't know, accounting. I want to do what you've seen, making stuff.
I'm curious, your work over the last 5 years or so, some of the topics that you brought up, I'm curious how it's kind of transformed, or if at all, your concept of freedom and liberty in that way. I think a lot of times when we're visualizing abolition, the flip side of that is the people on the outside. And when you start looking at these installations, these exhibitions, it really makes you question what freedom kind of means in a lot of ways. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so when Shahidul was in jail, I realized that part of my activism was a means to transcend pain. And I was recently at a talk at Birkbeck, and it was a Palestinian feminism talk, and they had someone ringing in from Palestine. And she was talking about the guys who'd crossed the Israeli border, Hamas and others. But she was saying many of them were very young and have faced a lot of violence throughout their lives and lost family members, and they're always trying to transcend pain. And it makes me think that, it made me then realize that liberation is very similar to love, because my love for my uncle was a way of me transcending pain. And love, even in any normal, non-political situation, is that we're trying to transcend the pain of life. And just like love, resistance is this kind of uncontrollable force. And when I say love, I don't mean in a kind of hippie sense. Love can be quite frightening. There are taboo forms of love, forbidden forms of love, but it's this kind of force of nature. And for me, resistance, freedom, liberation are very similar. They're kind of nourished by the same root.
I was just wondering if you feel like the art making and the way that promotes international activism functions as some kind of protection for people who are still in Bangladesh, or is it the opposite, or how does that work?
Yeah, so sometimes I'd make something to campaign for a prisoner that I didn't even know, and I put it on Instagram. I don't actually like social media, but I have to do it, and then it would get one like, and that would be it. And I think, I don't know why I'm doing this, I've got an audience of about 2. And then maybe 9 months later, I suddenly get another like on that, and then I get a message, and I look at the message, and it's that prisoner, and they say, I'm released. I think what they were doing is that they were looking up, after they were released, they were looking up who spoke out for them, who did what. In this case, it was Abul Kalam, who's a Rohingya refugee photographer who is jailed in Bangladesh. He said, I'm released, thank you for doing that. And then he still continues to send me photographs from the Rohingya refugee camps, because also he's an artist, and they have to make a living and still promote their artwork. So he's really open. He's like, can you promote our artwork? And their photos are incredible. Like, I see so much rubbish that has thousands of likes, and their stuff hasn't hardly any likes, but they use their cameras like prophets. And I was like, their work is incredible. So I start using their work in my work, and then we have this relationship. But it's happened a few times. Another one we made during lockdown was for photojournalist Kajol, and my daughter made that one. She made this little samosa packet saying, where is Kajol? And then we posted it, and I thought nothing will happen, but children are brilliant because they're not cynical. She was like, something's going to happen. And the next day I get a message, and it's a boy, and he's like, that's my dad. Kajol is my dad. and he's texting me from Bangladesh. And he says, I can't campaign because it's lockdown, we're not allowed to have mass gatherings, can you help? Can you mobilize? So then I mobilize and get all the kind of artists from here and activists, and everyone does where is Gajal? And then suddenly Gajal is found on the Bangladesh-India border, blindfolded and handcuffed and jailed, but at least he's not killed. And the lawyers tell me it's almost certainly because there was international exposure by then that he wasn't killed. Not just me, this is never just about me, many people were doing it. And then they always keep in touch. And then another thing that was important, that while Gajal was jailed, we then made sure that his photographs were being published in art newspaper and Western publications to keep their careers alive while they're in jail.
Probably have time for one more question. So does anybody in the audience have it? Go ahead.
So climate change is kind of a meta crisis that impacts a lot of the fights for social justice. And I'm curious, as an architect, if you have any insights about how architecture will have to change in order to adapt to a hotter climate.
Yeah, I have quite a lot of thoughts on this because climate change and sustainability is talked about every day, every hour in a corporate architecture office, because they know that the developer won't get the project unless they show that they're being green, and they won't make their profits unless they're shown. But in my 25-year career, not once did they talk about migrant labor or human rights. And I felt horrible to see Bangladeshi workers, my people, putting up these green 5-star sustainability buildings in Saudi or wherever it was. And these buildings were winning 5-star sustainability ratings, knowing that migrant workers or construction workers had been abused or sometimes killed on those sites. And I think it's not possible to talk about sustainability unless you're talking about human rights, labor, social justice. And I can't take an architect seriously unless they are. But the whole industry is completely absent of that part of sustainability. And for me, nothing I did on sustainability in those 25 years resonated as much as this one letter that Professor Sai Baba wrote to his wife Vasantha. And in one paragraph he talks about the climate change, where he talks about the heat in his cell and how El Nino and the monsoon is too late this year because of climate change, and they're putting wet blankets. He's 90% disabled, so he had helpers, and they were putting wet blankets on the floor of his cell, and they were drying immediately. And in this one paragraph, he talks about that. He talks about the farmers and how they're affected by climate change. And no one had ever talked about climate change in that language, in that way, in my whole career. So I'm quite tired of the North's approach to climate change.
I think we're done, but you just talked about the North, and I feel like it's always important to think about the relationship when we're in the U.S. of attending to violations outside of the U.S., especially in the Global South. And I wonder, since you live in the UK, if you could just talk at all about your sensitivity toward that, how you manage that, both wanting to draw attention, and then perhaps how the way you're working with your artwork is a part of your way of managing.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm glad I did do all those years in the corporate world, because now I know exactly how it works and my eyes are open. And although it was very disappointing, that career, there'd be times when I'd be running down the stairs with rolls of drawings thinking my life wasn't meant to be like this. One thing I did decide was never to burn bridges, because there were individuals within those companies who were really good to me, and they mean well, but they just have a completely different mindset. And also I changed, who am I to be a moral judge? I changed. So I stayed friends with those architects, and then they've seen the kind of trajectory of my career, and they've seen the kind of work I'm doing and the criticisms I make, and they've actually been really generous, and we're still friends. And like my old director, I'm still good friends with him, and we meet and we talk, and yeah, I think in that way they've also understood how I was never comfortable in that environment, but they've come with me as well. Does that make sense?
It's beautiful.
Can we get a big thank you and round of applause for Sofia? So if you haven't had a chance yet to see Sofia's work on view downstairs, the galleries are open till 9 p.m. tonight. And I highly encourage you to, now having heard Sofia talk, take a look at them, as well as go over to the Institute of the Arts and Sciences in Santa Cruz to see both her diptychs and her models on view there. All three exhibitions will be open until January 5th, so there's quite a lot of time to see the shows again and again. We hope you continue to keep coming and seeing them. And then one more thing, we are opening another show in our upstairs galleries up here, Cristina Fernandez, Multiple Exposures, on Friday, next Friday, not tomorrow. So please join us for that opening celebration. Thanks everyone.